Why is your teacher so much easier to understand than anybody else? Should you read transcripts or subtitles before, during, or after listening? And why do I refuse to recommend certain podcasts? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to answer questions from students about listening comprehension in Mandarin. And the reason I do this week rather than any other week is that there is a listening challenge on for May, and it starts on May 10th and lasts until the end of the month. Signing up is completely free, and for more information about the challenge, you can check out the written article on Hacking Chinese, where I've also included lots of information and advice about what to listen to and how to listen. If you're listening to this episode in the future, you can still head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com and see what challenge is on when you are listening. Before I get to the student questions, I'd like to announce a new sponsor for this challenge and for Hacking Chinese in general, and it is Learning Chinese Through Stories. And this is a podcast that aims to teach you Chinese in Chinese through stories. Long-time listeners will recognize Learning Chinese Through Stories because I've mentioned them basically for every challenge for the past few years, simply because they have one of the best podcasts available if you want to stay in Chinese, which you should as much as possible. This is not terribly difficult if you're an upper intermediate or advanced student, because there are many podcasts aimed at you and you can make sense of them in Chinese. But if you haven't reached that level yet, it's great to have someone who can explain things and make sure you understand without relying on translation. And this is something we will get back to later in this episode. All the Learning Chinese Through Stories episodes are actually available for free on most podcasting platforms, so you don't need to pay to access that. And for the duration of the challenge, you can also access transcripts and word lists for free. And more information about how to do that is included in the written article on Hacking Chinese, so please check the show notes. One active participant in the challenge will also win 2 months access to their premium membership community. So please use the link in the show notes to sign up for the listening challenge and improve your listening together with the rest of us in May. Let's get started with the 3 questions about listening comprehension that I've picked for this episode. And if you have any questions you'd like me to address in an upcoming Q&A, you can send me an email, leave a comment on Hacking Chinese, or chat me up on social media. As usual, we have 3 questions, and the first is about the common phenomenon where you can understand your teacher but nobody else. The second one is how to best use transcripts and subtitles to improve listening comprehension. And then the third question is about why I refuse to recommend certain podcasts. So let's get started. The first question is from Olga, and it's about understanding your teacher but not understanding other people. And I think that this is something that most learners of Chinese, who have had a teacher that is, have experienced at some point. You're doing quite well in class, you think you can make sense of what your teacher says most of the time, maybe not all the details, but at least the gist. But then when you speak Chinese with somebody outside the classroom, you suddenly are clueless, you don't understand almost anything of what people say. This can be very discouraging, so it's worth to talk a little bit about why this happens, and maybe a little bit about what you can do about it. We did, of course, talk about why listening in Chinese is hard in last week's episode, and many of the things that I'm talking about here are related to things that we talked about last week, so I suggest you listen to that episode as well. But here I will, of course, focus on teacher Chinese specifically and what makes it different from, well, normal Chinese. As I said in that episode, one of the reasons listening is difficult is because you lack control. If you speak yourself, you choose the words that you want to use, and naturally you will choose words that you know. And when you talk with somebody who doesn't know you and don't know what you know, they can't choose words that you know, even if they want to, and so they will use a lot of words, grammar, and so on that you are not familiar with, and this will make listening very hard. Now, this is true if you're listening to normal people, but if you're listening to your teacher specifically, they know exactly what you know, and if you're a beginner, they might know every single word you know and also have a good idea of how well you know it. And having taught lots of beginners myself, I can tell you that as a teacher, I develop a very acute sense of what the students know and what they don't know. And this is particularly true if they are learning Chinese as a foreign language, so say learning Chinese in Sweden rather than in China. Because most of the vocabulary they know will come from things that I have either presented to them or actually taught them directly, and so I do know what they know. And if you've been teaching for many years, maybe using similar teaching materials, similar stories, and so on, you will roughly know what people know at what stage and what will be considered difficult for a student at a certain level. And this is true even if you have like a full class of students. It's not just if you're teaching one-on-one. I would say that one of the most important functions a teacher has for beginner students is to provide them with comprehensible input. And that essentially means listening and reading that you can make sense of, and particularly listening, of course. And not just because that's what we're talking about in this episode, but in general because it makes sense to focus on the spoken language first. This means that a competent teacher will do everything they can to make sure you understand what they're talking about. And there are many techniques of doing this, and you might not realize that this is going on in the classroom, but I can promise you that if you have a good teacher who you can understand easily, they have probably built up an ability to do this and use various techniques to make sure that you understand. When you move outside the classroom and talk with someone who doesn't know what you know and they don't know all these techniques and they don't have years of experience speaking with learners, you will of course find it much harder to understand what these people say. While I think this is maybe the most important reason why students find strangers hard to understand, there are lots of other factors, some of which we talked about in last week's episode. So just to mention a few, you've built up a familiarity with your teacher's voice, their accent, the way they speak, and so on, and this makes it immensely easier to understand them compared to somebody you're not familiar with. You can also count on your teacher saying things to you that you can make sense of, well, otherwise they wouldn't say it. And they also build on themes and topics you've covered in class before, so you can be relatively certain that the content makes sense. Whereas if you're talking with somebody outside on the street, they don't know what you know when it comes to topics and content and so on, so they might talk about anything, and that naturally makes it harder. In essence, you can think of it as when your teacher speaks, you kind of know what to expect, and there's only a certain range of things that your teacher will say, but when you speak with a stranger, the range is basically unlimited. Then there are some more obvious reasons, such as teachers usually having a lower rate of speech and having a pronunciation that is clearer, more standard, and thereby, for most students, easier to understand. Now that we know why this is difficult, let's move on to the second part of the question, which is what to do about it. And this is a very difficult question to answer in a few minutes in a podcast here, because the question is basically how do I improve my ability to understand spoken Chinese? And that's something we have covered in many episodes and articles, especially in the series Beyond Timbudong, that I will link to in the show notes. But generally speaking, comprehension is important, so start by listening to things you do understand. You're learning a lot from doing that, and then you can diversify and include more varied Mandarin, including from different speakers about different topics and so on, as your Mandarin improves. Being able to instantly understand anything said to you in Chinese, even with little context, is very hard though, and it's a challenge that will follow you all the way up to an advanced level. If you buy my argument from last week about Chinese being more context dependent and thereby putting a heavier burden on the listener, this should indeed be harder than in many other languages. Let's move on to the second question, which is from Diego, and he wants to know how to use transcripts when listening. And I'm going to expand this to also include subtitles and just generally written support for listening. How should you do that? Should you read before you listen? Should you read while you are listening maybe? Or is it better to save the transcript and read after you've listened? Or should you maybe not use a transcript at all? There are several ways of approaching this question, and they will yield slightly different results depending on what you're after. First though, let's see what transcripts and subtitles actually do for you. And I would say that their most important function is to make the input more comprehensible. And this assumes that you can read Chinese at least at roughly the same level as you can listen, or better. And this is usually the case because when you have a transcript, you can take your time, especially if you're reading before you listen. It's also easier to look up unknown words and so on, so generally speaking, I would say using a transcript increases comprehension. This means that you can access content that is more interesting to you or more important for you, rather than being limited to things you can understand without a transcript or subtitles. I think this is an important point to make. even though I think that comprehension is one of the most important factors when choosing what to listen to, enjoyment and interest are also very important. So if you really like a certain type of movie, for example, by all means watch that movie, use the subtitles if that enables you to understand more. This is maybe not where you should spend all your listening time, because, well, if you don't understand much, you probably won't learn much. But if this motivates you to learn more and improve your listening, or your Chinese in general, that's great. So far, it sounds like transcripts and subtitles are great, but there are some downsides we also need to discuss. And the main one is related to your purpose for listening. Why are you listening? And we assume that you're listening partly to improve your Chinese, but what aspect of Chinese are we talking about? Is it to build vocabulary, maybe? Is it to build a feel for the language? Is it to improve your listening comprehension specifically? And the answers to these questions will influence whether or not a transcript or subtitles are useful. So yes, it is true that you will understand more if you use subtitles, if you can read those subtitles, but you're not really focusing on the type of form meaning connections that you're after. And when I say that, I mean form as in written form, say characters, or spoken form, the way words are pronounced and said. In one case, you're looking at something and then associating what you're looking at, the characters, to meaning. And that is great for reading comprehension, but listening comprehension is something different. It's about taking the spoken sounds and associating those with meaning. And it's not at all obvious that you will get better at doing this, even in the long term, if you mainly make these connections in the written language. There's also a whole range of listening strategies that you might never develop if you rely too much on the written language. So essentially what I'm saying is that if you're reading instead of listening, well, you might build your vocabulary, you will get better at reading, and it might have some impact on your listening. But if your main purpose here is to improve your listening ability, you should definitely not read before you listen. You shouldn't read while listening either, but it's perfectly fine to get that comprehension afterwards, when you've already listened many times and you just can't get any further. Then it's great to be able to check things you missed or look things up using a transcript. It is, after all, much quicker and easier than looking something up that is purely in spoken form. There is also an argument to be made that you should always listen before you read, and indeed I've written an article with that exact title. And the reason is simply that it's easier to find good reading materials than it is to find good listening materials. So don't waste the good listening by reading first, in other words. So the way I would approach this as a student, in most cases then, if the goal is to improve listening comprehension specifically, is to choose listening content that has a transcript, because that makes subsequent steps easier. But I would not use that transcript before I've exhausted my ability to understand something relying only on the spoken language. And then I would use the transcript to fill in any gaps or make sure I understand things that I might have missed and look things up, etc. This brings us to the third and final question, which isn't from a specific student, but it's rather a comment I received on my article recommending the best podcasts for learning Chinese. And I excluded a lot of podcasts that are very popular and that people liked, so I received a few comments and questions about why didn't you include X, Y, or Z in your recommendations. And sometimes it's just because I think there is a better podcast that does basically the same thing, just a little bit better. Or sometimes it's just that I missed the podcast that you happen to like. I've spent a lot of time listening to different podcasts, but I'm sure there are many great podcasts I've never heard of. So if you know of one, please recommend them. I'm happy to check them out and update my recommendations. The most common reason I left out popular podcasts, though, is that they contain way too much English. And that can seem a little bit hypocritical considering that this podcast is in English. But I think the goals are very different. My goal is not to directly improve your listening comprehension or your vocabulary in Chinese. Instead, the tagline on Hacking Chinese is "Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime." So the idea is to teach you how to learn so that you can then get more out of the time you spend with the language. The issue with many of the podcasts aimed at Chinese learners, and this is especially true for beginners, is that their goal is to help you improve your Chinese directly. It is not teaching you how to fish, it is rather to give you fish. And if you're going to do that, you should stay in Chinese as much as possible, just like learning Chinese through stories does, as an example. When we talked about the question about transcripts and subtitles, I mentioned that you learn by making form-meaning associations or links, so between the written language and the spoken language and the meaning, essentially. And I said that when you want to improve listening, it doesn't help that much if you're making these connections in the written language. But an even worse way of doing it is making these connections in another language. So if I tell you what something means in English before I tell you in Chinese, you don't even need to listen to what I say to make sense of what I'm saying. You can make these connections anyway because you know English. And I then strongly believe that translation should be the last method you rely on to understand something in Chinese. This doesn't mean that you should never use translation and that any teacher who translates anything is always bad. It just means that it shouldn't be the first thing you do and the default option. For example, there are many ways of making Chinese comprehensible without relying on English. And if you check my podcast recommendations and you look at the beginner category, you will see that there are many methods for making Chinese comprehensible that doesn't rely on using translation. For example, if there is a video, the teacher can use body language and images and so on. I think most people have seen this. It can also be helpful to repeat things, to circle back to the same thing over and over, to give examples, to rephrase things in different ways to make it easier to understand, and so on. And if you have no clue what I'm talking about, either as a student or a teacher, I strongly suggest you check out some of the Learning Chinese Through Stories beginner or at least the lower level episodes, where they do this quite well. They might start with a sentence, maybe from a song or a poem or something, that is actually rather difficult, but then they work with this small piece of content for a while using much simpler Chinese, allowing you to understand something above your level by using Chinese you can make sense of. So this is why I didn't include podcasts that include a lot of English or rely heavily on translation for you to understand what they're talking about. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's focusing on the wrong thing. And while it might make you comfortable as a student to feel that, yes, I can understand these things, if this understanding comes through English, this is just a false sense of security and you're not building the competence and the experience you need to understand spoken Mandarin directly without going through translation. So I will keep updating my recommendations as new podcasts appear and as I hear about them from kind students who are willing to share them with me, but I will stay away from podcasts that rely heavily on English or translation to make sense. If you really like these podcasts, go ahead and listen to them. I mean, there is little I can do to stop you, but I won't recommend them for the simple reason that I think that listening to podcasts that are entirely or almost entirely in Chinese is just outright better for improving your Chinese. Okay, so those were the 3 questions about listening comprehension in Chinese. And like I said earlier, if you have questions you want me to address, please send me an email or leave a comment on Hacking Chinese. Don't forget to join the listening challenge, and I'll see you on the leaderboard. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.